So let's get started with chapter 13. Chapter 13 is all about the spinal cord. So we're going to learn some basic information about the spinal cord and then go into spinal cord function and what it does as part of the central nervous system. So let's get started with a little bit of general information. The spinal cord is going to extend from our foramen magnum down to about the second lumbar vertebrae. A lot of people don't realize that the spinal cord does not go through our entire vertebral column. It ends at L2. Also remember that the spinal cord is really just a continuation of our brain. So the brain and spinal cord are connected. We just change names as it exits the foramen magnum. Now, there are different segments of the spinal cord named similarly to our vertebral column. The cervical is in our neck, thoracic, the chest, lumbar, lower back. And then even though it ends at L2, all the branches coming off the spinal cord go into the sacrum, so we call that the sacral. Now, coming off of the spinal cord are 31 pairs of peripheral spinal nerves. And those are the nerves that are coming out of those intervertebral foramen. And they will spread out and go to each region of our body and provide both motor and sensory input to and from the central nervous system. Now, the spinal cord is not uniform in diameter. It kind of gets thick and thin depending on its function. So thicker areas like in our cervical and lumbar region give rise to a lot of these nerves that are coming off and these nerve branches. Thinner areas in the thoracic region just have a pair of nerves coming off. So it's just characteristically not, like one same diameter cord going down. Now, the brain and spinal cord together form, remember, our central nervous system. And the central nervous system, along with our spinal cord, are going to be involved with spinal cord reflexes. We're going to have an integration and processing center in the spinal cord. And of course, it is a pathway to move information up and down to and from the brain. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the spinal cord protection. And this also is brain protection. So what I'm going to mention here also pertains to the brain itself. The brain and spinal cord are all protected essentially in the same way. So we're going to go to our first handout, Handout 13A, and we're going to discuss the different types of spinal cord protection. So I'm going to zoom into this, and what I have here are different layers that wrap around the brain and spinal cord. Now, the first thing that we need to realize is that there are three membranes that kind of wrap around the spinal cord to protect it. These are called meninges. So if you recall, in previous chapters, I've mentioned that our heart has a bag around it called the pericardium. The lungs have a bag around them called the pleura. Your abdominal organs all have bags wrapped around them. So like your stomach, your reproductive organs, your intestines, they're all wrapped in what's called the peritoneum. But with our brain and spinal cord, it's wrapped in a bag as well. These bags are called the meninges. So I'm going to write that down. Meninges. This is the bag that wraps our brain and spinal cord. It consists of three membranes: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So you can think of it as kind of like a triple membrane. So I can kind of show you here. Imagine this is our brain. I'm going to make a few gyri and sulci. Wrapped up against the brain are these membranes. And there's 3 layers of these membranes. Kind of like this, that are wrapping around the brain itself. Okay? Now, the outermost layer that is closest to the skull and the vertebrae is the dura mater. The dura mater is made out of really dense, irregular connective tissue. It's a very thick, protective layer. In our brain, it's sandwiched between the skull and the other membranes. In the vertebral column, it's right up against the vertebrae. Then we have, in the middle, we have what's called the arachnoid mater. And that's because it's made up of a webbing of collagen that kind of looks like a spider web. But it's the middle membrane. So it's kind of sandwiched between that dura mater and this innermost layer called the pia mater. The pia mater is right up against the brain and spinal cord, and it's a very thin layer. But these 3 layers make up what we call the meninges. Now, in between them, we've got these spaces. So in between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, we have this space called the, above the dura mater, I should say, darn it, between the brain and the skull, or the spinal cord and the vertebrae, we have what's called the epidural space. So the epidural space is sits between the skull and the dura mater, and between the vertebrae and the dura mater. It's made up of mostly fat, and this is where they can inject anesthetics. If you've ever heard of like a pregnant woman who's having her baby, she may get an epidural. The epidural is where we inject anesthetics into this epidural space, and that's going to help with deadening the pain. Not only pregnant women have this done, but if someone's in a bad accident or they're in a lot of pain for some region of their body, they may get an epidural. Okay, so the second space is called the subdural space, and that's the one I goofed on. That's the one that is between our dura mater and our arachnoid mater. It's made mostly of interstitial fluid. So this space is filled with basically our tissue fluid. And it's just a mechanically protective barrier. And then between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, we have this space called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is full of cerebral spinal fluid. Now, we'll talk about cerebral spinal fluid a little bit later in this chapter, but it's essentially just fluid that is a protective structure. It doesn't really do anything else other than protect. So it's kind of like having a fluid-filled cushion between your brain and your skull and your spinal cord and your vertebrae. So here at the bottom of the handout, I just put these in order. All right. And I mentioned here that these are called meninges. So for the vertebrae, we have our for the spinal cord, we have our vertebrae. Then between the vertebrae and the dura mater is this epidural space. So the dura mater. Then we have between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, we have the subdural space. And then between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, we have our subarachnoid space. So these are the orders in which these membranes occur. Now the membranes are just simply a protective structure. They're just protecting our brain and spinal cord from injury. And you can think of them as very similar to the bags that wrap other organs like the pericardium, the pleura, and the peritoneum. So that is how our brain and spinal cord are protected. All right, let's move on.